nearly 2 million Russian troops advancing inside Ukraine, many questions are being raised. What are the chances of the West getting involved in the war in Ukraine? What is Russia's plan in Ukraine? What is the interest of China in this war? What is the impact of this global war? When Westerners say their interpretation of security is correct, Russia and China speak differently. On February the 24th, a Chinese spokesman said that the media was talking about Russia's attack on Ukraine. But when the United States did not ask permission from anyone to enter Afghanistan and Iraq, why were these words not used? Then why international law or UN permission was not taken? The Chinese point out that the rule of law, the most important pillar of the Western-controlled world order, is now in question. In an interview with U.S. television network CBS News, Ian Bremmer, founder of the U.S. think tank Eurasia Group, says that no one in Europe has thought of a conflict in the last 3 decades, which has now changed. When Russian President Vladimir Putin says that any assistance to Ukraine would have serious consequences, it is good to know that the United States and NATO have already stated that they will not deploy troops to protect Ukraine. The blockade that the West is going to impose on Russia is a little less than the blockade on Iran, although it is the highest blockade on any great power. However, the economic sanctions imposed on Russia by the United States will be very difficult for Europe to implement. Rising prices for energy and agricultural products will be even more pronounced, and Europe could lose at least 1% of its GDP in the next 1 year. China, on the other hand, criticizes the blockade on Russia, but may not try to avoid it. Speaking to Gallup, a U.S. consultancy firm, George Friedman, a U.S. geopolitical thinker, said Putin may have thought he would get his demands from the West out of fear of an attack. He may have taken Germany's dissent in particular as a pillar of his claim. That did not happen. Putin must have understood that the United States would not comply with Putin's written promise that NATO would no longer be extended to the east. Now Putin has found nothing by attacking. NATO's demand to limit the eastern border has not been implemented. Friedman emphasized China's interest in the Ukraine issue, saying that while Russia and China could not help each other militarily, China might provide economic assistance to Russia amid the blockade. But after China's recent real estate crisis, it is uncertain how much financial aid they will be able to provide to Russia. The United States has said in a statement that it had deployed 2 aircraft carriers near China, signaling that the United States was capable of controlling the two forces together. Robert D. Kaplan, chair of the Robert Strauss Hoof Chair of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a U.S. think tank, says in an article in the National Interest magazine that the main issue, despite the war over Ukraine, is the unity of the West, where Germany is the main problem in Europe. It is a victory for Putin to be able to catch any kind of rift in NATO, even if he is stuck in Ukraine. During the Cold War, the West had no economic dependence on the Soviet Union. But as a result of globalization, Russia and China have become economically important to the West. There is also the Taiwan issue in East Asia, as in Ukraine. If it were ever understood that the United States could not, or would not save Taiwan from Chinese aggression, then all U.S. allies, from Japan to Singapore, would be interested in normalizing relations with China. He thinks that the way the Soviet Union collapsed from the inside could be the same for Russia. Much, however, depends on how Western nations, Russia and China, manage their own internal problems. In the short term, much will depend on how long NATO can maintain its momentum of unity. Kaplan thinks the competition for Eurasia, the world's most important region, will intensify in the coming days. As part of this, there could be conflicts of interest between the West and China in the Middle East. Iran may be at the center of this conflict. Because Iran is at the same time the gateway to Central Asia, it is located on the important shores of the Indian Ocean. Russia's attempts to assert its rights have failed miserably, fearing a military strike. As a result, Putin had no choice but to conduct limited military operations in Ukraine. But it is impossible to hide the disunity of Europe. While Germany wants to use Russia in its economic development, France wants to reduce U.S. influence in Europe. On the contrary, Britain wants to keep the conflict with Russia alive. Where Poland sees Russia as a threat, the Balkan countries, from Bulgaria to Hungary, are unwilling to go against the Orthodox Church. NATO member Turkey also maintains relations with both Ukraine and Russia. Although the United States and Britain have threatened to impose economic sanctions on Russia, Western-backed Ukraine has not committed itself to defending international law without sending troops to protect the government, which would call into question the credibility of the United States as a friend. Russia must have made a mistake, but the biggest fuel behind it is the weakness of the United States after Afghanistan, and the conflict of interest between the West. China's support for Russia is telling the United States that it controls the world.